Right, back in 2010, I stumbled upon a book called The 4-Hour Body, a guide to rapid fat loss, incredible sex, and becoming superhuman. It coincided with a time where I was becoming heavily interested in health and fitness, so I bought the thing. The book was great. As a scientist, I could really relate to the key takeaway, which was the concept of a minimum effective dose, essentially working smarter, not just harder. Why spend 6 hours in the gym when you can get the exact same results in just 2? This was also the book that made cheat meals and cheat days a mainstream concept. Rightly so, the author Tim Ferriss was rewarded with a New York Times bestseller tag. Just like any good book, once you finished, you want to go hunt out more from that author. What I quickly learned was that this wasn't Tim's first New York Times best-selling book. Back in 2007, 3 years before, the bloke released the original clickbait title, The 4-Hour Work Week, Escape the 9 to 5, Live Anywhere, Join the New Rich. Also, another pretty punchy title. So at the time, I was halfway through my 7 years of university studying to be a dentist. And during my university, it was becoming more and more apparent to me that when I graduated, the amount of money that I could earn as a clinician would be determined mainly by one thing: how fast I could work. The faster I could work, the more patients I could see, the more procedures I could do, the more money I could eventually make. But as I got closer and closer to graduation, this realization really started eating away at me. The problem was that this went against the very reason I decided to become a clinician in the first place. And that was, I always wanted to do the very best for my patients. And the maths just didn't stack up for me. I noticed during the actual clinics that we had during university, there was a gap between what we learnt as best practice in lectures versus what the actual clinical supervisor dentist did on real patients in real life. That gap was cutting corners. The sad reality was that if you wanted to make a living, you had to cut corners, you had to get faster, you had to do things more efficiently and be more productive, see more patients, do more procedures. And that was something that just became more and more apparent to me. Around the time that I was having this epiphany at university, I started reading The 4-Hour Work Week, and frankly, that changed everything. This was the first thing that I had ever read that positioned entrepreneurship as something that is accessible. Until that point, I had always considered entrepreneurship to be something that wasn't accessible to normal people. There are a load of concepts within that book that you can definitely credit Tim for bringing to the mainstream. For example, the concept of dreamlining, which was consciously planning out a dream lifestyle that by creating multiple streams of income, that Aston Martin that you thought was never within reach is actually just around the corner and much more accessible than you first thought. He also explained the power of Pareto's law, so the 80-20 principle that you're probably familiar with, and the concept of geo-arbitrage, which is living like a king by earning in dollars but spending in pesos. This was the first book that highlighted the potential upsides of living an abnormal life, the opposite to the 9 to 5 traditional lifestyle. But for me, there was one thing that hit harder than anything else within the book, and that was the positioning of time being your most precious commodity. It doesn't matter how much you earn, we all have a finite amount of time on this planet. So that had me thinking, right, here I am about to enter a 30 to 40 year long career where I will have very little control over where and when I spend my life as a clinician. Knowing that I also couldn't reconcile the fact that for me to grow and increase my income as a clinician, I would have to cut corners and potentially jeopardize my patients' health. I knew even before I graduated that I was going to have to take a different path. So just like any personal development book, it's kind of pointless if you just read it and don't actually put anything into practice. 6 months after graduating, I followed Tim's advice and I went through the process of designing and creating a set of surgical instruments that I could take to market, sell into the industry, and hopefully make me a millionaire. Well, that was what I hoped. Sadly, by that point, my enthusiasm for the industry had basically vanished. So after going through the process of having these instruments designed, samples made, modifications made, I was then at a place where the next step was going to be to place a large manufacturing order, which would have been hundreds of orders, also costing thousands of pounds. This is also after investing a few £1,000s in research and development and sampling costs anyway. It was at this point where I was like, right, it is now or never. If I placed the order, that was basically me tying myself into an industry that I'd frankly become really jaded with. The alternative was cutting ties completely, saying goodbye to 10 years of working my utter tits off, dumping all of that specialist knowledge that I had accrued, and leaving behind an entire chapter of my life. What did I do? Well, I jumped. I jumped without knowing where or when I would land. Fortunately though, I landed on my feet. Sure, it was a rough ride initially. I had to start from the very bottom again in my mid-20s, which was a humbling experience. But if it wasn't for Tim's book that really made me think about our time on this planet for the first time in my life, I wouldn't have taken that leap into entrepreneurship and ultimately taken control over the direction of my life. Right now, we live in a time where entrepreneurship has never been more accessible. The 4-hour work week was never just about working 4 hours a week. What Tim created was a philosophical masterpiece cloaked in tactics that, if you dedicated yourself to learning, would free up your most precious commodity: time.